I think this has only been about 45 minutes. My sense of time says I've been speaking about 45 minutes.
You are right.
Okay, you said I have a total of an hour and a half, so be patient. I know, but we may not have that. We'll have some time for some questions, but there's more to be said. Be patient. So, I decided that I would develop a free software operating system or die trying. Of old age, presumably. Because back then, the free software movement, which I was just starting, had no active enemies. Lots of people disagreed, but they just laughed and forgot about it. So the big obstacle was not opposition, it was that we had a lot of software to develop to be able to really run a computer and do the usual jobs with it. And back then, nobody knew if we would ever finish this job. I didn't know. But when it's a matter of fighting for freedom, you can't afford to wait until victory is in sight before you start the struggle, because that means you miss most of the opportunities. You've got to start when you don't know if you're going to win, and then maybe you'll win. So I decided to develop a free operating system. And then I decided to make it a Unix-like operating system so it would be portable, so it could run on various kinds of computers. I knew it would take years to finish an operating system, and I knew computers might change during that time. So if it were not portable, it could be obsolete before it was finished. So I decided to follow the design of Unix. Further, I decided to make it Unix compatible so that the many users of Unix would find it easy to switch. But this had an interesting consequence. Unix consists of many separate components that communicate with each other through interfaces that were more or less documented. And the users themselves use the same interfaces to talk to all these programs. So to be compatible with Unix meant replacing each component compatibly. That meant that all the initial design decisions were made. The only other thing needed in order to start the work was a name. Now, in the 1970s, I participated in a community of programmers who shared our work. Free software was our way of life. That's how I learned that free software was a good way of life. If I had just imagined it, I could not have been sure it was good. But since I had lived it, I knew it was good. Well, in that community, we were programming mainly for joy. And among the things we did in order to make it more fun was we gave our programs funny names. And we had a custom in our community that when we were writing a program similar to some existing program, and that was something that in the whole computer field people had to do because programming was not portable back then. You'd see a nice program, but it ran on a different kind of computer. The only way you could have something like that was to write another one. So you did. But in our community, we had a special funny custom. When we did that, we would give the new program a name that was a recursive acronym saying that this program is not the other one. It's a humorous way of giving credit. So I chose a recursive acronym for the name of this system. Since it was inspired by Unix, but it was not Unix, I called it GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix. So people sometimes ask, but what does the G stand for? And I say, it stands for GNU. And sometimes they go around this over and over again if they're not programmers. Now, of course, the reason why I chose that name is that the word GNU in English is used for lots of jokes. And the reason is, according to the dictionary, the G is silent and it's pronounced new. So anytime you wanted to say new, you could spell it GNU and you've got a joke. Maybe not a very good one, but there are lots of them. And occasionally it is a very funny joke. So the important thing is, when it's the name of our system, don't follow the dictionary. If you talk about the new operating system, you'll get people confused. We've been working on it for 23 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is GNU, and it always will be GNU, no matter how many people call it Linux by mistake. But how did that mistake get started? Well, in the 1980s, in the GNU project, our work was to develop all the components that we would need to have a complete GNU operating system. So we developed piece after piece. I recruited people to write various pieces. I wrote pieces. And in some cases, we had some good luck, and somebody else released a free program that we could fit into the system and that would do a useful job. By 1990, we had almost all of the system, but one important component was still missing. That was the kernel, which is the program that allocates the computer's resources to all the other programs. Now, we started writing a kernel, but the project has not been successful. Our kernel doesn't work very well, so it's not what people use. In 1991, a college student in Finland named Linus Torvalds wrote his own kernel, which he got barely working in less than a year. And he released it initially under the name Linux, and initially it was not free software. The license of the first version of Linux had a restriction which was not acceptable. However, in 1992, he changed the license and adopted the GNU General Public License, which is one of many free software licenses. It's the one that I had written for use on most components of the GNU system. Well, since Linux was available under a free software license, it became free software. And thus the combination of the incomplete, almost complete GNU system plus Linux, the kernel, made a complete free operating system. And for the first time, it was possible to use a PC in freedom. But people got confused when the people who were distributing and using this combination got confused, and they thought the whole thing was Linux, even though really it was basically GNU. And they started calling it by the wrong name, and this error has been spreading faster than we can explain to people why it's wrong. Please help us to get credit for our work. Please call the system GNU plus Linux or GNU/Linux. Please don't call it all Linux. The developer of the kernel contributed an important piece, and he deserves some credit. But the thousands of people who have worked on the GNU project, intending to develop a free operating system since almost a decade before Linux became free software, deserve credit too. Please give us equal mention. We deserve it. But there's something more important at stake here than mere credit. Credit's not the most important thing in the world. Some artists get tremendously angry over not getting credit. Well, it bothers me, but that's not the most important issue. There's something more important at stake here, and that is your freedom. Not directly, of course. Whether you call the system GNU/Linux or Linux, that doesn't alter the license of any piece of it. That doesn't directly affect your freedom. But if we want to establish lasting freedom and maintain it, we have to teach people to value freedom. And the reason is that freedom is frequently threatened. And if you're not prepared to defend your freedom, you might lose it. Just look at the United States. where fundamental human rights have been taken away by our own leaders who said they were protecting us from other secondary, less dangerous violent terrorists. Oh, and by the way, I believe that the monster is coming here. Is there another protest planned? What? Good. Can you tell us where and when? Piazza della Repubblica. At what hour? 1500. Good. I will try to be there. I love protesting. I love protesting my country's worst enemy, and your country's worst enemy too. In any case, if people don't appreciate the value of freedom, they're likely to lose it. But the name Linux is not associated with freedom. And the reason is that people who think the system is Linux think it was all developed by Linus Torvalds and that it comes from his vision of the world. And what is his vision? It's the vision of an engineer. He says that he wants powerful, reliable software. Well, we all want that, all else being equal. He says that he developed Linux for fun. Well, I have fun programming too when I have time, but he doesn't say that freedom is important. And when people think he developed it all, they tend to follow him and they think that freedom is not important. The name GNU is the one that's associated with fighting for freedom and with these specific 4 freedoms that are the definition of free software. So every time you call the system GNU/Linux, you will teach people to think about freedom. Not directly, of course. You see, to explain these ideas will take you at least 10 minutes. And I hope that some of you will start doing that. But you may not have time on a certain day to spend 10 minutes explaining philosophy. So at least help us by saying GNU/ before Linux, because that takes just a second. Now, there's no way to explain a philosophy in 1 second, but at least you can make the other people aware that the system in question is GNU and Linux, so that later on, when they see an article about GNU, and that meant like one of our articles where we talk about freedom, they will realize this is worth paying attention to because I use the GNU plus Linux system. If they think that they're Linux users, they might not even bother to read our article. People have said this, what does this have to do with me? These are the ideas of GNU, and I'm a Linux user. How ironic. They are using the GNU system and they don't know it's the GNU system, so they ignore what we say about freedom. So by your spending a second occasionally, you can help prepare people to pay attention when somebody else connected with GNU explains the issues of freedom. There is no more effective way you can help us in 1 second. So please do it, even if you don't do anything more. But why is it important? Why do we need to focus on freedom, on thinking about freedom? The reason is that today we have something we didn't have 20 years ago. Enemies, powerful corporations that have a lot of money and are pushing laws that would make it illegal to develop many kinds of free software. One of these laws already exists in most of Europe. I'm sure the directive has been implemented in Italy. I don't know the details. But in France, I know, even to possess a copy of the free software that can play a DVD is a crime. People can be put in prison just for having free software to watch a movie. That's the kind of evil law that is adopted by governments that are working for the media companies instead of for their own citizens. And the pressure to do this exists worldwide. Of course, the companies that try to do this, the big media companies, together with Microsoft and Apple, use the help of their pet government in Washington to impose this on other countries. We have to fight against this. We have to fight to abolish that law. And they're trying to impose other laws. In the US, any software or computing idea can be patented. And when that happens, anybody who develops a program which implements that idea can get sued. Well, look at your word processor and you'll see that it combines thousands of ideas. It has hundreds of features, and many of those features are complex enough that many different ideas can be seen in one feature. Well, that's thousands of ideas already. And then there are other ideas inside which an end user doesn't see, but they're still there. Well, every one of those ideas might be patented and might get the developer sued. So the result is that developing software becomes like crossing a minefield. With each design decision, probably nothing happens. But you have to make thousands of design decisions, so it adds up to a lot of danger. It's no surprise that a study of one large program a few years ago found almost 300 US patents, each of which prohibited something going on in that program. There's only been one such study as far as I know. It's a lot of work, and in order to do it, you have to be following all the software patents, which is a gigantic job. So there's only been one such study, but I expect that every large program is prohibited by hundreds of patents. It's a stupid system, and a government that is wise would not adopt this system. But the mega corporations want it, and they're trying to impose it here through the European Union. We now have to organize politically to keep free software going. 20 years ago, the doubt was whether we in the free software community would be capable of developing a broad range of useful software. Today, we've mostly done it. The doubt now is not whether we're capable, it's whether they will allow us to do it. So we have to organize. We have to organize against laws that forbid free software or forbid specific kinds of free software, but we also have to organize for positive change. For instance, government agencies should use free software exclusively. Every government agency is doing its computing for the public, and it has a responsibility to maintain full control over its computing. It may not allow control to fall into private hands. But that's exactly what happens if it uses a proprietary program. So public agencies must never use proprietary software. There should be a law saying that public agencies must use only free software. Above all, schools should use and teach exclusively free software. For instance, this university should only teach free software, should only have free software in the computers that students use. And this is not just to save money, although that's important. But there are deeper reasons. For instance, many proprietary software companies have a practice of donating gratis copies to schools. And why do they do this? Is it because they're idealistic and they want to help education? I don't think so. They are trying to convert these schools into instruments to impose dependency on their own students. They want the schools to teach the students to be helpless and divided, dependent on this non-free software, so that after they graduate, they will already have this dependency, and it would take hard work to get out, because you have to learn something new. It's not the hardest thing in the world, but it's work. So you can be sure that these same companies are not going to donate gratis copies of this non-free software to those ex-students. And they certainly won't donate gratis copies to the companies those ex-students go to work for. So the point is, the school teaches dependency and thus imposes it on the rest of society. They might as well be giving addictive drugs to the school to inject into the students. Schools should refuse to do this. But there's a deeper reason, and that is because schools have a mission to teach not just facts, not just skills, but above all, good citizenship, the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping your neighbor. So every class, at every level, should have a rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share it with the rest of the class, or else don't bring it here. But the school has to practice its own rule. It has to set a good example. So the school must bring only free software to class. This university should migrate, and those of you who are students or faculty here, organize, look for other supporters, and pressure for the school to start migrating. It may take a few years, but the point is they have to take a big step every year. If they only take a tiny step, well, divide the whole job by the size of the step and say, how many decades will it take you to get there at this rate? If they want to get there in 5 years, they've got to migrate 1/5 every year. This is serious. You must organize. This school must stop teaching people dependency on evil companies that mistreat their own customers. Now, you may notice that there's a term I haven't mentioned in this speech. That term is, quote, open source, unquote. The reason is that that's not what I'm in favor of. What does open source mean? Open source refers to pretty much the same software, the same free software, plus a little more, because there are a few open source licenses that don't qualify as free software licenses. Fortunately, they're not used very much. There are some programs under those licenses, but few. So if you find out that a program is open source, you've got a 99% chance it's free software, but you can't be sure until you check the license. However, there is a big difference between open source and free software at the level of philosophy. That's where the main difference is. Because the philosophy of free software is, this is a social, ethical, and political movement for freedom. Whereas open source, the philosophy of open source was chosen in 1998 as a way to forget about the ethical level. Open source advocates talk about how to develop powerful and reliable software, and that's all they mention as a goal. They don't say that it's an ethical issue. To the open source promoters, they say that proprietary software is likely to be an inferior solution. For the free software movement, proprietary software is the problem, and replacing it with free software is the solution. So it's a completely different philosophy based on different values. Open source cites only practical values of convenience. Open source says that it recommends a development model on the grounds that it's likely to result in more powerful, reliable software. Well, to the extent that's true, I think it's a nice bonus. But freedom and social solidarity are far more important than the convenience of the software. So if I had to choose between a powerful program, a convenient program that tramples my freedom, and a not-so-convenient program that respects my freedom, I choose that. And not only that, suppose what we really want is a program that is powerful and reliable and free, and that is, respects our freedom. But there isn't one. Suppose our only choice today is the powerful proprietary program or the inconvenient free program. Which one gives us a chance to get the one that's ideal? If we start with the inconvenient free program, we can rewrite it and make it better until we get a convenient free program. But if we start from the convenient proprietary program, there's nothing we can do to liberate it. You can't get there from here. So there's only one path to there, and that's starting here. Whatever free program there is better than any proprietary program, because nothing is better than a proprietary program. A proprietary program is an attack on your freedom. It shouldn't exist at all. We shouldn't call it an inferior solution. It's the problem. So that's the difference between free software and open source. I'm a free software activist. I'm not in favor of open source. I won't agree to put my name on things that are done in the name of open source, because teaching people to value freedom in this domain is the most important job of all. And by the way, there is a common misunderstanding. Some people think that if software is released under the GNU General Public License, some people think that free software means software released under the GNU General Public License and any other license is open source. That's not true. Most of the open source licenses are free software licenses too. Any license that grants the four freedoms is a free software license. So the difference is a difference in philosophy. So I will now close by introducing my other identity. Some people have occasionally accused me of having a holier-than-thou attitude, but I think they're mistaken. Because when I meet somebody who doesn't work hard to promote free software, my goal is not to show that I'm better than he is, but to convince him to start doing it the way I do, to make him better. So I don't have a holier-than-thou attitude, but I do have a holy attitude because I'm a saint, so it's my job to be holy. Emacs started out as a text editor, which became a way of life for many users because they could do all their work without ever exiting from Emacs. And eventually it became a church with the creation of the news group alt.religion.emacs. Today in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between two rival versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we worship an editor. To be a saint in the Church of Emacs, to be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. The Church of Emacs has an advantage over some other churches because to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you have been searching for a church to be holy in, you might consider ours. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever proprietary operating systems have possessed any of the computers under your control and install a wholly free operating system where holy can be spelled in more than one way, and then only install free software on top of that. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you too may eventually have a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other text editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free version of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So thank you.